Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 347. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to talk about in today's show, so I just want to quickly remind people that one of the best things you could do for the show and to, help out the show is just to share it. So if you're listening right now, either, click the share button from wherever you're listening, or when you got time later on, if you're listening to the podcast as you're driving around, go either to the Twitter page handle at @con_interest, or find me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_, and just share the show. That kind of stuff really does help us to grow our audience. You can also support the show by doing your CBD shopping with Paloma Verde, CBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. When you use that promo code, you're going to save 20%, and the show's going to get a kickback. So it's a great way to get yourself some high-quality CBD products and to support your favorite podcast. I really recommend everybody check out the Sports Cream. All their topicals are absolutely phenomenal. As somebody who, even though I'm younger, I've always been a bigger guy. I played a lot of football growing up, so I've had a lot of knee pain, back pain, and I do a lot of stuff, out walking with my dogs and everything, so I get sore. I use that Sports Cream in the morning. I feel great all day. It's a nice menthol smell, so I really recommend people check out all the products at Paloma Verde. But if you're looking for my recommendation, get one of their topicals. It's really going to help out with any kind of pain you got going on. Now, before I get into the stories like I usually get into, I just want to take a couple minutes to comment because it's election day. I am a libertarian. I'm not big on voting, but I'm not, I never tell people not to vote or whatever. Like, go out, vote for whoever you want to vote for. I don't think it's a huge deal most of the time. And if we look at, the races we got going on today, most of the races were between two candidates who wanted to decide who was the bigger hawk. Not much good news to share. One thing to note, there's been a couple good write-ups on this. There's one at WarMia. I think that's the Washington Research Institute for Mideast, maybe. But they ran an article about how AIPAC had, started a couple political action committees and had actually a lot of influence in quite a few elections. And so, Israel is certainly on the ballot, and Israel is certainly winning in a lot of these elections. The AIPAC influence, I think a lot of that actually gets worked out at the primary level, so that the only two candidates running in the general, and, a lot of these House seats especially, it's already decided, right? Like, the actual race occurs in, February through September of this year during the primary season, when, people are voting for the Democrat or the Republican in either of these deep red or deep blue states. And whoever wins that primary is guaranteed to win the election. Or again, you make it so that either candidate who wins has essentially the same policy. Now, there are a couple candidates who get, credit on the war issue. And I wanted to talk about, I think, four conservatives. There's J.D. Vance. There is the guy running in New Hampshire, the general there. Then there is Blake Masters, and that might actually be it. It might just be those three. Now, I don't think any of them are any better on the Ukraine issue in a real way. Like, they may be for encouraging talks a little bit or something like that, but ultimately, their policy is very, very similar to the status quo. So I don't see any changes coming. I think all are slightly better on the Mideast wars, but that's a growing consensus in Washington, so that shouldn't be that big of a plus. So there may be some more real distance on some of these candidates on domestic issues that you care about, or different referendums on ballots that are worth voting for, but I don't see foreign policy being altered in any real significant way after this election. I think the Republicans are going to be just on board with this war. We had that statement from the House Majority Leader, or Minority Leader right now, McCarthy, about the Republicans won't give a blank check. Well, I think he literally means we're not going to give a blank check to the president to do whatever he wants in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that the Republican policy isn't essentially as the Democrat policy, and so it's going to end up being very similar. All right, that's all I have on the election stuff. I guess, there's probably more stuff to discuss, but I haven't found any particular interest or excitement in these midterms. I think the Republicans are going to do well, but I don't think it changes anything on the foreign policy angle. All right, now I want to get into the news, and this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. wants Ukraine to act like it's open to negotiation, but won't push for talks. This is one of the more wild stories I have ever read in the Washington Post. The Washington Post reported on Saturday that the U.S. is privately encouraging Ukraine to signal an openness to negotiations with Russia for public relations purposes, not actually to pursue diplomacy. Sources told the Post that the U.S. wants Ukrainian President Zelensky to drop his official position of ruling out talks with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is president, which is essentially a call for a regime change in Moscow. The idea is to maintain support for Ukraine from nations uneasy about Zelensky's stance on negotiations. The report read, "The request by American officials is not aimed at pushing Ukraine to the negotiating table," these people said. Rather, they call for a circulated attempt to ensure the government a calculated attempt to ensure the government in Kiev maintains the support of other nations facing constituencies wary of fueling war for many years to come. Zelensky's signed a decree ruling out talks with Putin's government after Russia annexed the territory it controls in Ukraine. U.S. officials told the Post that Zelensky's decree raised concerns in Europe, Africa, and Latin America, all areas feeling the economic impact of the war and Western sanctions on Russia. Ukraine's stance on peace talks and its maximalist war goals, which include expelling Russia from Crimea, show that they expect the war to last for years to come. And so, again, this was on Saturday. Dave wrote it up on Sunday. Now, on Tuesday, just this morning, there was a story in the AP that I read where Zelensky made comments saying that Ukraine would be willing to talk to the Russian government if Russia no longer occupied any Ukrainian territory. And so we are basically seeing that White House, or that Washington Post story, and that White House policy now play out where, Zelensky is sounding maybe less like he's on a hard line, but really it's the same position. It's a non-starter for talks with Russia. So that's kind of the situation on the peace talks. I think Putin said something, on it recently, basically saying that, Russia's open to talks, but, Russia has its terms as well. All right, so this next article from Dave DeCamp is also on potential talks and diplomacy. So the first article, I guess, I read as bad news, right? That the White House's goal isn't in any way diplomacy; it's fueling the war, and so now they're kind of exploiting diplomacy to fuel the war, right? The idea is that we need to, give the impression that Ukraine is pursuing diplomacy so they could actually, just continue to fight a military war and do the exact opposite of diplomacy. And so I don't know. It seems to me that it's a real push away from diplomacy. Now, I guess the other angle of that is maybe this is the only way the White House could even get Zelensky to pretend like he wants diplomacy, or to get Zelensky to stop saying that we're not going to negotiate with Vladimir Putin, because it sounds too much like a call for regime change. So maybe there's some ways you could find some good news in that. This next story, I think, actually is maybe a little bit of a positive single, but I'm not sure. Report: Jade Sullivan held talks, undisclosed talks with Putin aides. National Security Advisor Jade Sullivan has in recent months held secret talks with high-level Russian officials, the Wall Street Journal reported on Sunday, citing unnamed U.S. and allied officials. The officials said that the talks were aimed at reducing the risk of the war in Ukraine turning into a broader conflict, and that Sullivan warned Moscow against using nuclear weapons. They said Sullivan held talks with Yuri Yushkov, a foreign policy advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin, and that the Russian secretary of the Russian Security Council, Nikola Pushkev. As of Sunday night in Washington, D.C., the talks haven't been confirmed by the White House or the Kremlin. National Security Council spokeswoman was asked if Sullivan held the conversations and replied, "People claim a lot of things." That's not a denial, so kind of makes it seem like it's true. And I believe I had actually probably already reported on this. There was a report, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal or maybe the Financial Times. I want to say in September, I wrote a story for antiwar.com, basically saying that, the White House has sent messages to Russia not to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So I'm not convinced that, this is real diplomacy or anything in a positive step. Any kind of contact between U.S. and Russian officials probably isn't a bad thing. I guess of officials in the White House that you would hope would lead the negotiations, for me, Jake Sullivan is very low on that list. He seems like kind of a more deep state type creature where, Lloyd Austin, yeah, he's a part of the revolving door and, goes from Raytheon to the Pentagon, from the Pentagon and back to the Pentagon and everything like that. But maybe he's more loyal to Biden and less likely to, try to escalate things when he should be trying to de-escalate things, or botching talks when, the talks could have at least some level of success. So not great to see that Sullivan's leading it, but there is a potential for diplomacy here. Russia has nothing to say about the reported talks with Jake Sullivan. So that's, kind of where we're at there. This is the article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on November 6th, titled "American Arms Makers Are Cashing In on the War in Ukraine." And so when we think about the fact that a lot of people who are crafting American foreign policy have a vested interest in the U.S. arms industry. They make money when the U.S. arms industry makes money. And that right now the White House policy is to feint diplomacy in order to prolong the war. You really wonder how corrupt this whole policy is. So I write, the war in Ukraine has spurred European countries to seek hundreds of billions in new weapons. American arm manufacturers are the biggest beneficiaries of the increased demand for arms, according to a Yahoo News report. Ian Bond, director of foreign policy at the Center for European Reform, described the surge in markets for the weapons as the highest since the Cold War. This is certainly the biggest increase in defense spending in Europe since the end of the Cold War, he said. Melissa Rossi wrote in Yahoo that the American companies have been the biggest beneficiaries of the increased demand. Members of the European Union have planned to increase their defense budgets by $230 billion, led by Germany's plan to increase military spending by $100 billion. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, this is SPIRI, SIPRI, European governments get most of their weapons from American arms dealers. I think it's about 56%. The American weapons industry is defined by the revolving door, or the phenomenon whereby U.S. military officials take jobs on the boards of arms manufacturers after leaving government. Current Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was a general before retiring and joining the board of Raytheon. That lasted in the latest in a long line of Pentagon chiefs to follow a similar career path. After a short stint as a weapons executive, Austin now heads the U.S. Department of Defense and helps craft America's foreign policies. Austin's predecessor, Jim Mattis and Mark Esper, also served on the board of weapons makers. Mattis went from the Pentagon to General Dynamics, back to the Pentagon, back to General Dynamics. Esper is a Lockheed man, I believe. There were a couple other interim secretaries of defense under Trump, so I just went over the confirmed ones. But Patrick Shanahan was a Boeing man, and I'm not sure about some of the others that Trump had. The U.S. is the globe's largest arms seller, distributing 39% of the world's weapons from 2017 to 2022. American companies accounted for over half of all arms sales to Europe. SIPRI reports show that the Netherlands, UK, Poland, and France list the U.S. as their top destination for weapons, with Amsterdam spending 94% of its procurement budget on American companies. Senior researcher with Spiri Arms and Military Expenditure Program, Peter Wisman, told Yahoo that many European countries have plans to increase their military spending very significantly and to increase their arms and purchases as a part of that. Weapons sales show no sign of slowing down. Bulgaria's legislator approved a plan to buy 70 Lockheed Martin-made F-16s for $1.3 billion last week. The Secretary of the U.S. State Department approved a $500 missile sale to Finland. William Hartung, an analyst for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, told Yahoo that the weapons sales are growing at a rapid clip. Washington has said it will support Ukraine for as long as it takes and does not plan to push Kiev to seek a diplomatic end to the war. An extended conflict is expected to bring a major boon for the American arms makers. Western sanctions on Russia will prevent many former Warsaw Pact and USSR states from resupplying and upgrading their Soviet-era weapons. The Washington-led economic war on Moscow will force these Eastern European states to buy new weapons now. Many will be made in the U.S. Additionally, the U.S. and its allies plan to spend tens of billions of dollars arming Ukraine to fight Russia, with a bipartisan group of American legislators now seeking to pass a $50 billion aid bill for Kyiv. All right. And the Pentagon expects Congress to provide wartime purchasing power. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. On November 7th, Bill LaPlante, the Pentagon's chief weapons buyer, said he expects the Congress to grant the authority to allow wartime purchasing powers at a level not seen since the Cold War, Defense News reported on Monday. To continue arming Ukraine, LaPlante has been calling for the Pentagon to be granted the authority to lock in multi-year contracts for weapons purchases, which are typically reserved for procuring naval vessels and warplanes. The idea is to get arms makers the incentive to ramp up production. The Senate has added an amendment to its version of the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act to grant the authority. It would allow the Pentagon to make multi-year purchases through 2023 and 2024 of certain types of weapons made by Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Cobra Defense and Aerospace, and Raytheon, the former employer of U.S. Secretary of Defense General Lloyd Austin. The Senate is expected to vote on its version of the NDAA sometime this month, and it will then negotiate the final version of the spending bill with the House. LaPlante expects the wartime purchasing powers to make up the finalized version that will reach President Biden's desk. They are supportive of this. They are going to give us this multi-year authority, and they're going to give us funding to really put the industrial base, and I'm talking billions of dollars into the industrial base to fund these production lines. And man, this is a slap in the face with all this inflation going on, and the fact that, so many Americans really are like top concerned about inflation, and we're just going to throw billions of dollars to make weapons that we're going to ship to Ukraine, or maybe at best never use. It's just all a big corrupt scam for the people at the top of the military industrial complex. So this is maybe the most striking thing I've heard a U.S. official say in some time. Maybe you gotta go back to General Austin saying that the U.S. policy in Ukraine is to weaken Russia, to hear something like this. U.S. Nuclear Forces Chief says the big one is coming. And, the first thing I want to say about this is think of the mentality of this guy, right? He controls the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and he's going to say a line like, the big one is coming. This is psychotic and very concerning. So Dave writes, the commander that oversees U.S. nuclear forces delivered an ominous warning at the naval conference last week by calling the war in Ukraine a warm-up for the big one that is to come. This Ukrainian crisis that we are in right now is just the warm-up, said Navy Admiral Charles Richard, the commander of U.S. Strategic Command. The big one is coming, and it isn't going to be very long before we're going to get tested in ways that we haven't been tested in a long time. Richard's warning came after the U.S. released its new nuclear posture review, which affirms that the U.S. doctrine allows for the first use of nuclear weapons. The review says that the purpose of the U.S. nuclear arsenal is to deter strategic attacks, assure alliances and partners, and achieve U.S. objectives if deterrence fails. The NPR, that's the National Nuclear Posture Review, says the U.S. would only consider use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the U.S. or its partners. The U.S. has recently threatened to nuke North Korea. Like 3 officials. It was in a White House statement, a State Department statement, and a Pentagon statement, where we had all these officials threatening to nuke North Korea. The National Nuclear Posture Review was released with the 2022 National Defense Strategy that names China as the most comprehensive and serious challenge to the U.S. and describes Russia as an acute threat. The document, as with previous 2018 National Defense Strategy, makes clear that the U.S. military is preparing for future conflicts with both China and Russia. I think, this is kind of about and talking about what we have been talking, myself and Dave DeCamp, Connor Freeman, I think some of the loudest voices on this for a while have been that, look, as much as this war with Russia is serious and that this Ukraine business is very serious, and, we can't not talk about it. The deep state, the U.S. foreign policy, the Pentagon is directing itself against China, and that I think is where, with the coverage that we've had in 2022 about Ukraine and Russia, I think looking forward, it's going to be that level about China for years to come. Finland's president says no plans to host nuclear weapons. So this is a little bit of good news. Finnish president on Monday said Finland has no plans to host nuclear weapons if it joins NATO, although other Finnish officials said they won't rule out the idea. So some good news here. Not, the best thing, because it's not, I think, any kind of official. It's just a statement. So maybe they're just trying to reduce tensions or something like that. But nonetheless, hopefully it's a positive signal. And then this is the last story I have on Ukraine today. Ukraine uses wartime powers to seize strategic companies. And so, Zelensky just nationalized some companies. This is, of course, the great democracy that we have to defend. As I've been covering a lot recently, there's a lot of military activity and provocations going on the Korean Peninsula. Dave DeCamp wrote this one for antiwar.com. U.S. flies B-1B supersonic bombers over South Korea for the first time since 2017. And that 2017 date is really important in this discussion, of course, because 2017 was the first year of Trump's presidency. 2017 was the year of fire and fury, weapons like the world has never seen before, threats. 2018 was the year of diplomacy. And so if we're doing things that we were doing in 2017, this is mimicking Trump at his most aggressive. So Dave writes, 2 supersonic B-1B bombers flew over South Korea on Saturday, marking the first time the bombers were deployed to the region since 2017 as tensions continue to rise on the Korean Peninsula. The bombers participate in the last day of the massive aerial war games the U.S. and South Korea held, known as Vigilant Storm. The exercises were initially set to conclude on Friday, but were extended into Saturday over North Korea's missile test. North Korea made clear that it would respond to Vigilant Storm, which involved about 240 U.S. and South Korean aircraft. This year's iteration of the drills was the largest ever, and Pyongyang reacted by launching missiles and artillery, aerial war games near the border. Lots of military activity for the North Koreans. Now, one more note here is that after the drills were extended into Saturday, North Korea launched 4 more missiles. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced the extension of the war games after meeting with his South Korean counterpart and said the U.S. would deploy more strategic assets to the region. So this seems to be a pretty clear example of that. Now, let's move on and talk about Syria. We have a story from from Jason Ditz about a new base in Syria. Jason writes, a number of U.S. troops and logistics forces have been arriving in the Syrian city of Raqqa recently, are in the process of establishing a new military base in the area. The location made sense, though no U.S. official announcement has been made yet. The U.S. has an estimated 1,000 troops left in Syria and 28 declared military sites. They are mostly in the area around Raqqa, and so that's why the new base is located there. The timing is particularly telling, however. Just over a week prior, the U.S. says it has no plans to withdraw its military from Syria, and the National Security Council's John Kirby said the U.S. president is solely to combat the Islamic State. So, there is some Islamic State presence in Syria. I'm not going to say there's none, and this is all just to cover up a U.S. occupation. But, it really is about taking the oil and just trying to thwart, the Iranian influence as much as possible in the region. But, the worst part about it is it's killing the Syrian people. The U.S. occupation, taking the oil, the sanctions that prevent rebuilding are, people in Syria are dying of cholera. Babies are freezing to death during the winter. It's time to withdraw our forces from that country and just come home and let the Syrian people attempt to rebuild their country. So again, their babies don't freeze during the winter. This from Dave DeCamp. U.S. airstrike says 15 al-Shabaab fighters killed in Somalia. U.S. AFRICOM, that's Africa Command, said Saturday that it conducted an airstrike against al-Shabaab in Somalia on November 3rd as U.S. operations in that country continued to escalate. AFRICOM said that the strike killed at least 15 al-Shabaab fighters and that it was carried out near a coastal town in the middle Shabelle region of Somalia. In the past, the U.S. has carried out operations in this area of Somalia, and there's been a pretty serious response from the Somalis carrying out terrorist attacks and other attacks against at least attempted Western targets. So I got a couple of stories from my news roundup that I just wanted to mention and run through on today's show. The U.S. and Canada sanctioned the head of Haiti's Senate over alleged ties to drug and gangs. That was reported by Reuters. And then I caught this press release from the State Department where they were offering 3 separate $1 million bounties for men all accused of being Haitian gang leaders. It's not clear to me if this is the case. There is a lot of gang activity in Haiti. It's probably not hard to pick out who the actual gang leaders are, but at the same time, we never just take the State Department's word for it on this show. North Korea has denied it's supplying weapons to Russia. Biden sent a congratulations, or I think actually made a phone call to Benjamin Netanyahu on his election victory in Israel. So this looks to be that Netanyahu will return to power in the next, I think, week in Israel. It seems that the factions that will make up his coalition have a pretty solid majority in the Knesset after several years of a lot of political instability and turnover in Israel. This seems to be maybe the most conclusive election in probably 3 years of 5 or 6 elections. It's been a lot in Israel. So That was reported by Al Jazeera, by the way. It's apparently a very right-wing coalition that Netanyahu is going to use, and I want to talk about that at some point on the show. I haven't gotten all the names and all the figures down yet. We have from the German outlet DW reporting that American was killed in Baghdad. I think 6 or 7 other people were killed as well. This my news roundup from November 6th, and I don't think I have quite as many stories in this one, but I did want to mention that the U.S. is apparently looking to shift its satellite strategy, and they want to start prioritizing using smaller satellites over larger ones. And so my guess is that this is going to be a boon for uh, for like Elon Musk, who has a lot of these kind of satellites. And then the last story I have, there was one from Al Jazeera in the news roundup on the SIDS, just detailing that the U.S. transfers a lot of weapons, to a lot of countries around the world, but that includes Latin American countries where there's very little oversight of billions or millions of dollars, tens of $1 million in aid that we've sent there. All right, guys, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and if you can, please share the show and help us to expand our audience.